In the Lao Cai province of northern Vietnam, the mountains fold into each other so tightly that a village can disappear from sight in under a kilometre. Roads become footpaths. Footpaths become nothing. In the early 1990s, travellers moved through this terrain alone, on foot, carrying whatever they had, and sometimes they did not arrive. The people who lived in the villages of Lao Cai knew this. They knew the roads were isolated. They knew strangers passed through. What they did not know, for several years, was that someone was waiting for those strangers. His name was Doan Van Sang. And by the time Vietnamese authorities understood what he had done, the number of dead was somewhere between 6 and 11, a range that remains unresolved to this day. The victims followed a pattern, not because they knew each other, but because the landscape forced them through the same corridors. Lao Cai sits in Vietnam's far northwest, pressed against the Chinese border. And in the years following Doi Moi, the economic reforms that opened Vietnam in the late 1980s, movement through the region increased. Traders, migrants, people visiting family across provincial lines. The roads between settlements could take hours on foot, and much of that time was spent alone. Doan Van Sang lived in this terrain. He knew it the way a person knows a house they have walked in the dark for years. Every turn, every sound, every place where the light stopped. Investigators would later conclude that he targeted solitary travellers moving through isolated stretches, approaching them under the pretense of ordinary interaction before attacking. What made Sang's crimes unusually difficult to detect in their early years was the nature of the geography itself. Bodies disposed in dense jungle in a mountainous province, far from reliable infrastructure, do not surface quickly. People who vanished from these roads were reported missing, but in a region of this kind, in this period, the leap from missing traveller to murder victim to connected victims required investigative resources and communication networks that were strained. The exact dates of the first killings are not established in the public record with precision. What Vietnamese authorities eventually confirmed was that Sang had been operating for long enough that multiple victims had been killed and disposed of before he became a suspect. He was not caught because of a tip. He was not caught because of forensic evidence. He was caught because a victim survived. The survivor, whose name has not been established in available documented sources, managed to escape an attack by Sang and reach help. What they described to investigators was not simply an assault. It was an ambush, methodical and practiced, carried out by someone who had done this before and understood exactly how to do it, in terrain where no one would hear. The account was specific enough that investigators in Lao Cai were able to identify a suspect. Once they moved on Doan Van Sang, what they found went beyond the attack on the survivor. During the investigation and Sang's subsequent confession, the Vietnamese authorities documented that he had killed multiple people over a period of years. The confirmed figure reported in Vietnamese state media at the time of his trial was at least 6 victims. Some accounts place the number higher, but the forensic recovery of remains in terrain of this density is an imprecise process, and not all reported figures come with attached documentation. The element of Sang's crimes that separated this case from the category of remote regional homicide, and the reason it was covered by international outlets, was what he did after killing his victims. Vietnamese investigators and state media reported that Sang consumed parts of his victims. He was a cannibal. This detail, reported through Vietnamese state sources and referenced in subsequent regional crime reporting, has not been challenged or walked back in the available record. What the official account did not establish, at least not in documentation accessible outside Vietnam, was whether this was consistent across all victims or specific to some. Sang confessed. The confession Doan Van Sang gave to Vietnamese authorities was detailed enough that investigators were able to use it to reconstruct at least a portion of the timeline and geography of his crimes. He was cooperative in directing police to locations relevant to the investigation. This kind of post-arrest cooperation is documented in Vietnamese press accounts from the period, though the granular specifics of what he said remain in Vietnamese language sources, not fully translated into English. What is documented is the outcome. Doan Van Sang was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. He was executed by firing squad, the method used for capital sentences in Vietnam during this period. The trial received coverage in Vietnam's state press, and the case was noted in regional reporting on crime in Southeast Asia during the 1990s. It did not generate the sustained international attention that some contemporaneous cases did, partly because access to detailed court records and investigative files in Vietnam's legal system during this period was not structured for external scrutiny, and partly because the geography itself, remote, mountainous, a province most foreign correspondents were not stationed near, limited the flow of information outward. What filtered through was the outline: a serial killer operating in a mountain province, at minimum 6 victims, multiple years of activity, cannibalism, caught through a survivor's account, convicted, executed. The shape of the case is clear. The interior, the full victim count, the precise timeline, the documentation of individual crimes, remains inside a legal system that has not made those records publicly accessible. That gap between what happened and what is on the record is where this case sits. There are cases where the uncertainty is about guilt, where a conviction sits uneasily against contested evidence, where questions of innocence linger. This is not that kind of case. Doan Van Sang confessed. He was convicted on that confession and on the physical evidence investigators gathered. The uncertainty here is taxonomic. How many exactly, across what specific period, and whether the full scope of what he did was ever completely reconstructed. The victim count is the clearest open question. 6 is the figure most consistently cited in available sources. Some regional crime references, secondary sources drawing on Vietnamese press, cite numbers as high as 11. The difference is not necessarily a matter of dispute, so much as a matter of evidence recovery. In terrain like Lao Cai's, in the early 1990s, confirming that remains belong to a specific missing person required resources and time that were not always available. Some of what Sang described may have been recoverable, some may not have been. The cannibalism finding, documented in Vietnamese state media and repeated in regional crime reporting, has not been formally contested in the public record. What has never been established, at least not in accessible documentation, is whether this was a consistent feature of all the killings or of some. Whether it was ritualistic, functional, or something that doesn't fit either of those categories. The case was real. The conviction was real. The execution was real. What the outside world received was a summary, and summaries, especially of crimes this severe, in languages and legal systems with limited external transparency, have a way of calcifying into legend. Numbers that drift, details that compound, the outline becoming the whole story when the interior is unavailable. The people who walked those roads between villages in the early 1990s, the traders, the migrants, the families visiting across provincial lines, were real. The ones who did not arrive were real. Their names, in most cases, are not in the public record. Doan Van Sang was executed, most likely in the mid-1990s. The case closed in the formal sense. Perpetrator identified, tried, sentenced, killed by the state. The road through Lao Cai still runs where it ran then, and people still walk it. What this case leaves behind is a question that criminal justice systems have always struggled with. What does it mean to close a case when the full count of victims is uncertain? The 6 confirmed dead have that number attached to them. The others, if there were others, are attached to nothing in the record. Not a name, not a date, not a confirmed connection to Sang's confession. Vietnamese criminology researchers and journalists have revisited this case in subsequent decades, but comprehensive, independently verified documentation of the full investigation has not surfaced in publicly accessible form. The case exists in the international record primarily as a reference, cited in lists, noted in regional crime surveys, without the depth that a fully documented investigation would provide. What is not uncertain, that for a span of years, on the isolated paths of a mountain province, someone was hunting the people who used them. That a survivor walked out of the jungle and spoke. That the state listened, investigated, convicted, and acted. That the roads between villages, which had briefly become something else, became roads again. The survivor, the person whose account broke the case open, has no publicly documented name. Their testimony is the reason this case ended when it did. Their name is the one detail the record most conspicuously lacks. Whatever Doan Van Sang did on those roads, in those years, in that terrain, the full measure of it went with him. Thank you for watching this one through to the end. If a story like this is why you're here, hit subscribe. We open a new file every few days. Every file in the vault has a story. We'll see you at the next one.